Go ahead, Marina. You're muted. You're muted, Marina.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom, for those kind words in introducing me. Yeah, so today my presentation is part of a larger project in which I am looking at the interaction of the Mizo people in today's Mizoram in the period from around the 1880s to the early 21st century with neighboring tribes and with the British, which includes both government administrators and Christian missionaries. This will give you an overview of what I will present. We have objective of the study and of the paper, the space, westward migration, land and the village, when the British came, translating heaven, from Pialral to heaven, and concluding remarks. The objective of this larger study is to understand how the present Mizo Christians' fate in life after death continues to be in conversation with concepts that goes back to pre-Christian times, and how that Mizo Christian concepts inform their life before that. Tracing and studying this process of translating heaven into beliefs and social practices of today requires in some parts some imaginative writing, because a lot of the history that needs to be addressed is no longer directly accessible. Today, I would like to draw attention especially to the traditions and archaeological evidence of the Mizo. Most of this has been transmitted through the writing of non-Mizo scholars, and to my knowledge, no research has systematically looked into the oral resources among the Mizo. What the Christian Mizo of today consider to be their story and history is, in the perspective of this study, the result of a cultural memory process based on interactions among themselves and with the British, be it a government officer, a missionary, or even a merchant. It should be clear what everyone assumes to know about the past in Mizoram today has been affected by the shift from the oral tradition to written communication, and through a continuous process of re-evaluation in the light of cultural and social negotiations. From there emerged the understanding of what it means to be a Mizo and what defines the space they were dwelling in. The emergence of the space called Mizoram and what the interacting persons in that emerging space and period said and are reported to have done is understood to be drawn from the discourses, the underlying features of which are accessible only in the statements of the persons involved. According to Michel Foucault, discourse forms the subject or matter about which social agents talked, and their statements become meaningful only within the discourse. Those who move and express themselves in such a discursive field create what in turn became the formative space for those who followed after them. I will attempt to construct such a discursive field by depicting the life of the Mizo, around the time when the first missionaries entered the Lusai Hills, as these were called at that time. This will be based on the link made between the existing sources, such as the oral tradition, the writings of the British colonial administrator or missionaries, and some archaeological and anthropological evidences. I agree with Patsuaw and Van Strengdel, who say that the peoples populating the hill regions of the Northeast shared the following characteristic. They spoke related languages. Their lifestyle were based on specific forms of agriculture and hunting that the hills allowed. They had common cultural and religious principles, and they lived beyond the reach of state. The distinctive identities of the various tribes are emphasized by the multitude of different languages spoken, and that the tribal dwell separated in federal, state, and tribal areas. On earlier maps, the region stretching from today's northeast to Myanmar was labeled as unknown and autonomous territory. The British colonies came on the western side from the plains of Assam and the Chittagong Hill, on the other side of the mountain range in what is now Myanmar, which the British colonizers also took control. I start by retelling this is the map that I was just talking about, and then I will continue with that. Sorry, I had just misplaced my slide a little bit. I start by rereading the Mizo story as a series of movements and clashes in a space which is perceived by the actors from different perspectives. This will enable us to interpret the process of translating heaven in a discursive field, which is formed on the one hand by cultural, social, and religious interactions, and on the other hand, becomes the reference frame for practices to become meaningful. The map depicts the migration of the Mizo ancestors. It is based on tradition that has been preserved within the Mizo community and has been passed down verbally from one generation to the other, and there are no written historical evidences for this. A memory common to the Mizo, whose story we're looking at, is that in time immemorial, they came from a hole under a rock and started to walk on the surface of this earth. The rock with the hole underneath it, which the different tribes claim as their common origin, is named Thinlung and is assumed to be somewhere in the northeast direction from Mizoram. While the story has an assumed starting point in space, the moment in time immemorial is not fixed. At one point in time, the clan started to move southwest, but there are no written sources about when and how long it took before they reached the region in today's Mizoram. Concentrating on point 3 and 4 of the common characteristic of the hill tribes mentioned earlier, there is no foolproof methodology to reconstruct a cultural memory of the period from the time immemorial to the time when the tribe started to interact with the British. The main sources for such a reconstruction seem to be the writings of the British, who relied on indigenous informants and who claim to have all gathered information recorded and written down correctly. What follows is an imaginative description on the basis of various sources which cannot be discussed in detail in this paper. It is an attempt to reconstruct a discursive field in which elements and social practices become meaningful. The ancestors lived on agriculture and hunting and led a semi-nomadic life. Their ideal village was on a hilltop with a vast space or land surrounding it. The site for the village was chosen in such a way that the next village was far enough so that there would be no need to fight for land or water or hunting grounds. They needed the jungle around for their jhum fields and as hunting grounds and to gather and collect what they needed for their daily life. The writings of the British seem to imply that there was no strict social order among the Mizo, which would have defined the order of the settlement of the villages. The layout of the villages shows that the center was defined by the chief house. In front of the chief's house, there would be a free space, which was used for the festivals and for meetings. Here, the chief would sit on a platform and hold his council and deal with village matters. Another prominent center in the village was the Zolbuk, or the bachelor's dormitory, where the young man went to sleep at night. The Zolbuk was a space where the young men would sit and receive instructions about their ancestors, their place and role in the community, and the whole community's expectation of them. In short, all the knowledge that a young man needed to learn in order to live his life according to the tradition handed down from his ancestor. In the Zol book, they would learn the code of how things ought to be done and what not to do and what makes a Mizo a good person, following the code of Tlomwaina. Parry, one of the British administrators in the then Lusai Hills, tried in 1927 to grasp the spirit of that code, and he writes, a person who possesses Tlomwaina must be courteous, considerate, unselfish, courageous, and industrious, and he must always be ready to help others, even at considerable inconvenience to himself, and must try to surpass others in doing his ordinary daily tasks efficiently. The village, known as the Kwa, was the space for daily life and for some of the daily work and of social relationships and of festival. There was no particular place in the village for something that could be interpreted as religion. The village and its houses were the place where people were vulnerable to sicknesses which were believed to be caused by spirit. The gift or knowledge of the priest was essential for identifying the cause of the sickness and to prescribe the cures for such illnesses, as well as to find ways to avert other negative influences caused by the spirit. One common reason for sickness was attributed to witchcraft, and this was greatly feared and sometimes led to violent reactions against those who were accused of practicing it. The area around the village was called Ram, and in order to survive here, hunters, warriors, and travelers needed to not only have the practical skills and knowledge on how to survive in the jungle, they also needed to have the knowledge about the places inhabited by spirits, so that they could avoid meeting them and not to be harmed by them. From a spatial perspective, the borders of the area that villagers would consider as their territory, wherein they could freely roam, were not fully fixed. The borders were respected on the ground of the power of those holding it, not on titles on the land. Territorial supremacy was often a region for fights when villages would be raided, and the men who were not killed during the raid, along with the women and children, would be forcefully taken as slaves to the village of the victorious group. In such events, villages may disappear and the borders of the territory would be redefined by the victorious chief. The description has highlighted so far how social practices and roles defined the space and filled it with meaning. The social ideal of many Mizo clan was a person titled Thangchua. There were two ways of achieving that status. One was connected to hunting in the jungle, Ram Lam Thangchua, and the other outside of the village, and the second to the life and position of a household in the village, which would be called In Lam Thangchua. To achieve the status outside the village, a man would need to kill enemies and several prescribed wild animals, such as an elephant, a bear, a sambor, barking deer, wild boar, or a wild mitten, and also a snake and a hawk-like eagle. So I have here a picture of a stone plate where you have the picture of a Thangchua engraved in the stones with the animals the prescribed animals that he is supposed to have killed. To achieve this status in the village in Lam Thangchua, a series of 5 sacrificial public feasts for the whole community had to be organized. This was rather costly and only few rich persons could afford to do this. Each feast lasted for about 3 or 4 days, and in the course of the festival, several pigs and mithun were slaughtered and prepared for the common consummation by the whole village. The two realms, the jungle and the village, were distinguished, yet interconnected. The Ram Lam Thangchua had to defeat enemies and wild animals on his own outside the village. And you have the In Lam Thangchua, which involved the whole community. For each and every animal that he killed outside the village, he had to perform a sacrifice in the village in order to conquer not only the animal, but also its spirit. Only after such a sacrifice in the village would he fully dominate the spirit of the killed animals and enemies. He had to perform such a sacrifice in order to keep the spirit from haunting him in this lifetime and to be able to dominate them so that they would be his possessions, slave and servants in Pialral, where he was expected to go. All over Mizoram, one finds what the so-called megalith structures with a high concentration in the Champhai region at the border with Myanmar. Malsom Liana observed that the Mizo erected megalith monuments like the one which I showed at the entrance of the village, and everyone entering the village could know which powerful man lived or had lived in this village and which power was concentrated here. The deeds for which Ramlam Thangchwa is praised refer to the virtues of the true Mizo warrior. Those of the Inlam Thangchwa refers to the merit a person can obtain. If we change the perspective, the deeds of the first Thangchwa are connecting to the space that the Mizo clan or tribe is claiming. The elephant stands for the plains, the birds for the skies, other animals for the forest and for wider areas such as those required by the wild bovine and boar, and where the copra can be found. Killing the animals who were a constant threat because they would rob a village, steal its supplies, and lead its people away to enslave them for work in other places was defending the village and guarding the space of the clan. In some cases, the existing megaliths were in collective memory associated with a later story that made sense to the later generation. A spatial perspective leads to a better understanding of the multitude of the erected stones and their placing as a network of sign, which express something about the locality and its culture of remembrance and communicates that to those who visit the locality. In particular, those signs can be attributed to the Thangchwa. The stone connects the locality to the shared understanding of space and of community across the different tribes and clans, which is reflected in the shared social practice associated with that figure. I have presented a picture of the life of those the Mizo of today consider as their ancestor. The description focuses on space and how it was formed and marked by social practices, culminating in the two aspects of the Thangchwa. It is based on the one hand on what everybody assumes to know among the Mizo. This is a collective memory that unites the Mizo by speaking about what they share as a culture grounded in a time immemorial. Even this time immemorial has a spatial dimension by being linked back to a particular place from where the migration of the Mizo started. What everybody remembers is, however, a slippery source because it usually does not account for the transformations and changes that what is remembered went through several processes over the decades in which an identity called the Mizo, as is understood today, emerged. The second source for reconstructing the changes comprises of the writings of outsiders such as the British, that is the colonial officers, missionaries, and academics. It is again not a reliable source because it is tainted and eclectic, even though most of the writers claim to have had a systematic approach. My presentation is an attempt to describe, characterize, reconstruct from both sources the understanding of space, land, time, and a way of life of the Mizo ancestors. This has been done by focusing on their practices and style of living and less on their beliefs. It should create a reference space in which cultural concepts such as Thangchwa, though considered as an accomplishment of an individual person, involve the social life of the whole village. During the time we're referring to, the term the British was also a metaphor for a system of colonial administration, a set of regulations and instruments that had proved effective in other regions and was now implemented in the hill states. It was a discourse on rule, land, culture, and race. In the frontier situation of the hill state, The British were, however, also individuals who were struggling and muddling their way through the new circumstances that they were not used to. One such individual at the time, during the 19th century and in the region I'm looking at, is Thomas Lewin. And Lewin defined his position saying, "I took my standing among them as a chief, paramount in the district, but yet subject to a greater white chief in Calcutta." So you have him, the picture of Lewin. What he meant is well explained by his account how he impressed a chief of the Sendus in the Chittagong Hills as he marched toward the east by claiming that he and the chief were from the same clan. The basis for this was the pronunciation of his name in the chief's dialect. The chief name is given as Tuikam Tongloin, and Lewin pronounced his own name to him as Urbert Tongloin, whereas he usually rendered his name as Thomas H. Lewin. Lewin explained regarding this encounter, "Sensation. We exchanged pipe in token of the bond between us." Later, after the successful British campaign into Lusai land, he reports, "Numbers of quondam enemies, the Silas, came to visit me, for my name had become great in Lusai land. They called me father and named children Thangliana after me, it being, as they averred, a name of power and good fortune. They later erected a monument to commemorate the deeds of Thangliana, not a megalith, but made of stone, at the place where his house stood." My interpretation is that Lewin felt more comfortable with the way the clans were dealing with power than with administering the colonial system he was expected to install. A hint to that could be the remark by his superior on his lacking judicial, procedural, and administrative qualification, whereas he was in his own place and time undoubtedly successful in dealing with the clans. This is an important point because it demonstrates that Lewin, as a colonial administrator, negotiated power between the system he found among the Mizo clans and the colonial system he was taught to represent there and to impose on them. Though he adapted to the style of life and the exercise of power of the tribals he dealt with, his opinion on land usage was quite different from theirs. To him, the country was empty because the local population had no concept of making use of the land like the more advanced races he believed he belonged to. He shared the idea of the British of his time and mainly saw the possibility of exploiting the space to start and develop tea gardens, rubber plantations, and other agricultural activities, as well as for hunting. The British defined the hill fort as marauding bandits, whereas those exercise what they considered to be adequate in relation to space, land, and the people. They were not defending a territory that should be put to use and administered like the British did. They claimed the use of space and land and jungle according to their practice of life defined by the ways of their ancestor. The point I wish to highlight is that the cultural clash was not only on the diverging attitude to the right use of land. Part of the colonial mindset was that those who did not settle, cultivate, and exploit the land in order to create revenue had no legitimate right on the land. The legitimization for the colonial enterprise was based on a hierarchy of civilizations in which those not achieving were doomed to perish. In the eyes of the colonizers, they did not extinguish a people. The people vanish according to a natural law if they are not able to develop to a higher state of civilization. There are other aspects connected to this understanding of land and territory. It was not only the divergent understanding of territory, it is also a different reading of what power means. For the tribe, the power was invested in the person of the chief. It had to be exercised and proven to be strong, and it relied on the power relations that they were able to implement and maintain. They raised income by raiding others, by exercising the direct power of the stronger, not on the basis of being the owner of the space the other occupied. This power constantly had to be defended. Against this background, I will show in this passage how the concept of heaven was translated from a pre-Christian concept into a Meso-Christian concept and retained some of its spatial characteristics. Pyalral and Mithikwa are the two places where the pre-Christian Mizo believed they would go to after death, depending on their achievements in life. Pyalral was meant for those few who had in their lifetime performed the act of Thangtswa. Mithikwa was the place where the souls of ordinary people would go. There they would continue to work and toil forever, as they did during their lifetime, without really being able to enjoy the fruits of their work. This is to say that a social distinction in the community was translated into different places in space. Shakespeare, another British officer in the Lusai Hills, reproduced in the book The Lusai Kukui Clans of 1912, a map drawn by an indigenous informant, presumably a non-Christian Mizo. How to find the way from a Mizo village to these two places. He added to this his map the location of a Christian village and the place where the Christians go to after death. He notes that the path to this Christian heaven is guarded by Iswa, which is Jesus, and that the paths to the two mentioned Mizo places were guarded by Satan. This means that roughly 20 years after the missionaries started to reflect on how to communicate the Christian truth of heaven to the Mizo, Jesus and Satan were placed in the space in relation to the places where Mizo believed they would go after death. A concept which in the Christian tradition is a temporal one become part of the spatial concept of the pre-Christian clan. Shakespeare comments that the insertion of the figures, Satan and Jesus itself, is a good example of the translation process of heaven I'm interested in studying. He comments that the map is showing a broad spirit of tolerance in the author, who, without abandoning the faith of his forefather, is ready to admit the truth of Christianity and its suitability to those who profess it. Moreover, the informant sees no difficulty in providing in the unknown lands beyond a grave a special country for each race, just as there is in the world he knows of. So you have here the Christian village, you have the Christian village, you have Iswa, that is Jesus, and you have the Mithikwa and the Lake. You know, all that is from the Meso-Christians belief. This is an interpretation based on Shakespeare and his contemporaries' worldview that there is a conflict of truth which would urge convert from the faith of the forefathers to the Christian faith to decide for one side and declare the other as an error. For me, it would be more accurate to say that as a representation of space and with the embedded meanings, the map displays an understanding that there are several places in the world, and depending in which village you lived in your life, you will walk after death to one of the possible places. Just as there were the spaces held by other tribe or clans, there were different places for Mizo and for Meso-Christians, and the path to their dwelling place after death needed to be guarded. The part of the Meso-Christians was guarded by the strongest power they knew, that was Jesus. The described concept of the land being the place for the wild that needed to be dominated and conquered, and of the spirits that needed to be warded off, and also to be turned into servant spirit, is connected to the spatial location of the route to Pyalral and the place itself. Even though Pyalral is to be attained after death, that is a time perspective or concept, it is a spatial concept that is connected to the physical land in a particular geographical location. This is demonstrated by the fact that the informant did not place Pyalral on his map, but its assumed location, the lake, which really exists. So you have this lake in Myanmar, in the Myanmar region at the moment. The map drawn by a Mizo informant shows that from the Mizo Kwa or the village, 7 roads from all the world of the Mizo lead to one place. Such a place can be identified on the map of the Champhai region. in Vangchia, a place with 171 stone plates and megaliths like the one I have shown earlier, 7 roads meet, of which one leads to reveal the lake, which the Mizos believed that their souls would go after death, to enter the realm of Pialral and Mithikwa. There resided a figure called Pupola, the guardian of the access to the village of the dead and to Pialral. And that had been translated now to as Jesus guarding the Christian village. The Ram Lamtangtswa on his journey to Pialral was imagined to be sitting on the head of the deer he had killed, holding its horn. The snake that he had killed would wind itself around him, and the hawk he had shot down would fly above his head like a shadow, so that Pupola would not be able to see him and could not shoot his pellets at him. All this imagination, beliefs point to the fact that the Mizo had a map of their world, which included its knowledge about the physical space, the distances, the hills, the rivers, and the roads to travel across. This spatial concept was further enhanced by the history and experience of their migration, which they connected to certain places that became the docking point for some folklore. It also had a spiritual dimension in the sense of a concept of nature that was alive and living and driven by the spirits of the plants and the animals and the spirit that were dwelling around them. It is ultimately a concept of the run of life from birth through all the hardships of life in the natural physical world and the constant necessity to ward off the influence of the spirit until eventually the soul of the disease would find its way to either Mithikwa, the village of the dead, or to Pialral. Before it enters, the soul would drink the water that would make it forget its past so that it would not want to return to its former life and haunt the living. When with the imposition of the British administration in the Northeast, the traditional world was turned upside down, Welsh missionaries came in 1889 and 1894 with the gospel, filling the vacuum and cultural void created by this alien rule. Protestant Christianity itself was gradually modified as a result of its insertion into a Mizo worldview. For my purpose and research, it is important to note that Mizo Christianity is not only the implementation of what the white missionaries preach, it is the result of negotiations and adaptations in which the Mizo had Azensi as the example proof. They, as I have elsewhere highlighted, have inserted, interpreted, and adopted the Christian faith from within their tradition. That means that we are able to find traces of such adaptations and reinterpretation of pre-Christian forms in the practice of their faith. The Mizo-Christian continued practices in celebrating important events such as Christmas or wedding, with slaughtering Agayal or Mithun, the large povan that played an important role in their pre-Christian rituals. The efforts of Christian missionaries to develop a lingua franca and promote education among the inhabitants contributed to their acquiring support from the populace. They gained converts to the faith, and in combination with other factors, Christianity began to spread among the people. Starting with modest number, churches began to record a phenomenal growth in members. From a point of view, the crucial fact was that Christianity was spreading throughout the region. On the whole, missionaries contributed to the development of a common language and a statewide religious faith. This development has contributed to the integration of the Mizo society. The Mizo learned from the missionaries as a kind of contextualized, customized, localized gospel, which proved to be very successful. Many of the old beliefs were now reinterpreted by them in the light of the gospel so that the Mizo could better understand its message. For instance, because the Mizo, like many non-Western people, did not have any equivalent in their indigenous system of the Christian concept of sin. They struggled to understand this message of Jesus Christ as one who atoned for sin. They were instead better able to understand the concept of Savior, conquering the power of darkness and death and liberating them of this. Though the Mizo did not have the concept of a chief evil spirit, Satan was translated as Ramhuai Lalpa, which literally means Lord or chief of the evil spirits. In this regard, the missionaries reported that the Mizo were fond of hearing that Jesus Christ had conquered the devil and death. And often people come to us to tell them about Jesus. Not only was Jesus presented as the conqueror and liberator from the devil and demons, but also as the one who guarantees Pialral. The missionaries taught that all those who believe in Jesus Christ were assured of going to Pialral after death. The story of the love of God, Jesus' death on the cross as a sacrifice to save and redeem humans, and Jesus' resurrection as a victory over death itself, was presented as an answer to the two most significant questions for the Mizos, namely, how can I be liberated from the power of evil spirit or forces around me? And how can I attain the passage to Pialral? Pialral, a destination which was elusive for most of the Mizos, was democratized, and access to it was opened up for all those who embraced Christianity and had faith in the liberating work of Pathian through sacrificial act on the cross and in the resurrection. This resulted in all the different Mizo tribes who had their own separate Sakwa to accept Christianity as their religion, thus creating a union of different tribes under Christian Sakwa and a shift in their consciousness resulting in collectively assuming a common or shared identity. My interest in this paper was to delineate some of the epistemological preconditions forming a field in which eventually something like a Mizo identity of today emerged. My broader interest is, as explained, to understand how the present Mizo Christians' faith in life after death continues to be in conversation with concepts that go back to pre-Christian times, and how that Mizo Christian concepts inform their life after death. In order to do so, I have been retelling the story of the Mizo. I reread it as a series of movements and clashes in a space which is perceived by the actors in the story in different perspectives. My description has focused on space and how it is formed and marked by social practices, culminating in the two aspects of the figure of the Thangswa. It is based on the one hand on what everyone remembers or knows among the Mizo. This is a collective memory that unites the Mizo by speaking about what they share as a cultural, grounded in a time immemorial. Even time immemorial has a spiritual dimension by linking it back to a particular place where the Mizo started their long migration before they eventually settled in the hilly region that today is called Mizoram. With such an approach, it becomes more visible that what we observe today as Mizo Christianity has been affected by the shift from the oral tradition to written communication and went through a continuous process of re-evaluation in the light of cultural and social negotiations among the Mizo and with the British, whether as colonizers, missionaries, or merchants. In these processes, the Mizos, as I have shown, were actors, not objects. Placing the translation of the lore connected to Mythiqua and Pialral in the mapping of the space as I did, I have shown how the concept of heaven was transformed from a spatial concept to a temporal one. The transition was accompanied by using the Mizo concept of direct and greater power as an interpretive approach to Jesus, who ensured the passage to heaven. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Marina. And as per usual, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, go down to the reactions box down at the bottom and go ahead and raise your hand to ask a question. Let me begin with one, Marina. I've had the great fortune of actually serving as an external examiner on a thesis that was looking at this Mizo adaptation, not as in depth as your own, but but just talking about the different, they call them revivals that took place, and you looked at 3 cycles of that. And one of the things that occurred, at least in terms of the thesis, was a sense of real pushback and back and forth between the Mizos and the missionaries, so that the missionaries sort of objected to some of the activities and thoughts of the Mizos in terms of this revival. And in the end, the Mizos sort of won out, all right? So there were things that they were able to put in terms of practices. And so my question is, in terms of your talk, have you been able to uncover any sources in terms of that revival period in terms of how that fit into that wider backdrop that you've displayed so well, in terms of where they once took on and became actors in that, but also ended up disagreeing with the missionaries of what the implications of what they were experiencing represented.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, maybe if we were to talk about the revival, I think the first revival happened when some of the Mizos went to Meghalaya, another state where there was a revival happening, and when they came back to Mizoram. Of course, when they went to Meghalaya, they were very sad that they did not, they did not feel the spirit touching them. They came back to Mizoram, and once they reached Durklang, a place in Mizoram, there they felt that the spirit was touching them, and then they started, like singing and praising God, what usually happened in a revival situation. So what the point that I'm trying to say is, I do not have a real sources or direct evidence to show how this happened, but then I would just say it is the work of the Spirit. And here to also emphasize that it was nothing to do with the missionaries who were there. They experienced it on their own, and it was very local. And with that experience also came with the revival, also the experience of, bringing the drum bags, the Mizo traditional drum, which they would use when in their from the time they were not from their pre-Christian days. But the missionaries interpreted and said that the drums is associated with their old religion and their old practice, and that should be abandoned. But with the revival, when the Mizo Christians started singing and they started using the drums and were very insistent on it, the missionaries had to bring it back and allow the drums to be used, saying that it's part of their culture and it may not be demonic as they had earlier said it was. So there were changes, also change of perspective on the missionary side as well. So as I have said, it was a Protestant Christianity that was, adjusting itself when it encountered the Mizo culture and the Mizo people.
Okay, Anton, you have a question. Go ahead and unmute.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marina, for this enlightening talk. I really appreciate it and learned a lot about the interaction of government and religion between different cultures meeting each other. I think that's very convincing how you show how the people on the ground were actors themselves rather than objects. Now, what I find interesting, kind of following up your research, is to ask why Christianity could provide this new framework of self-understanding and identity to the people in the light of colonial experience. And I think what we can say is that obviously Christianity itself was shaped in a colonial environment. And even the OT, I mean, the whole picture of God and the commandments is developed in a colonial context as a kind of counter story to imperial reign and powerful emperors. So I think what maybe would be interesting to add to your research is the question, what the people found. You mentioned the democratization of heaven. I think that is very, very convincing, but I'm sure there are more elements. Or would you think of more elements which people found, giving them energy in their new identity search in the face of colonialism? That's my question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Anton, for that question. Yeah, I would have to I would like to emphasize that the Mizos themselves were agents of the change and transformation, because unlike in other places, the hills where the Mizos live was restricted area. You don't have the you don't have the presence of British colonial power, and like you have in mainland India. So at one point of time, you will just have one or two missionaries there. So, and it was not possible for them to, to have evangelized the whole region by themselves. So mainly it was the indigenous Christians, the first generation Christians, who went around traveling and shared the gospel with their neighbors and their people that they met. And then what I would like to emphasize here is the position of the missionaries. They were non-conformists. They were not Anglican missionaries who came with the power of colonialism and the government and the colonial power, because the non-conformists were not even really allowed. They did not have the freedom like the Anglican, missionaries. So they were vulnerable. They were in a vulnerable situations. And also when they came to Mizoram, they did not have anything. They did not have power. So you have the Mizos, talking about them as two wandering fools. Who are these fools? White fools. They were considered to be two white fools, and they tried to make sense of what do they want here? Why are they here? But slowly, in encountering and interacting with them and sharing their stories about Jesus, they came to embrace Christianity and found value in what they were talking about. So it wasn't just about access to Pyalral, but because the Mizos led a very hard life, and all their lives and energy was spent towards propitiating the evil spirit, which they thought were responsible for all the bad things that could happen. So when they found Jesus, who had defeated all the evil spirit, it was indeed a good news. They no longer had to try to, pacify the evil spirit that they believe were lurking in every corner. It was less expensive. They didn't have to spend time. So that was really an advantage for them. So they accepted the gospel because it was meaningful to them. It was good for them. Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Very, very interesting, Marina. I have a number of questions, but I'll just ask one now. I wonder if you could go back to that fascinating map drawn by a Mizo. I think you said non-Christian?
Yes.
I think I want to know as much as can be known about what, if you like, the assumptions are about how you read a map like that. I mean, is it like some maps in medieval Western thought where heaven is at the top and hell is at the bottom? You said quite a lot about it, but I wasn't sure how you got that out of what we could see.
Yeah. Thank you, Stuart. Actually, I mean, like the Mizos, there's a lake called Reedil in Myanmar, and that is where the Mizos believe that the souls of the dead would go to enter the two places, either Pyalral, where the Thangswa would go, and the Mithikwa, where the ordinary people to go. So it's in the land, physical land, beneath the lake. So their understanding of, even though it's about after death, their understanding of the space where the souls would go is actually very physical in the present land. And so I was talking about the map that was drawn by the Mizo, the non-Christian Mizo. So there was a map where he had, 7 paths leading to different villages. He had the village of Jesus village, the village of the Mizo, and, and Satan and all that. So there was the 7th part. And then we have a place in Sampai, an area where there is a megalith, which is called, it's a historical place. And it's known as the Great Courtyard. I'm translating it literally, the Great Courtyard, and that has lots of megaliths and, stone erected there. And from that center, there were 7 paths. Okay, there were seven roads that lead into different direction. And one of the road leads to this Reedil, the place where they suppose that their souls would go after that. So I find a connection there with that Great Courtyard that we have, the actual physical space, with the map that this person had drawn, a place with 7 roads leading to different places. Does that answer your question? So it's the imagination of how the Mizo believes that all the physical spaces and even the space which they cannot really access to, but will have access only after their death, is also a space in the space that they are occupying while they are alive. So it's very unlike what, a Western map, medieval map or map that you would have seen, because this is all an imagination, but it's also at the same time, I say imagination, but it's still linked to a physical space of the Great Courtyard with 7 roads leading into different direction.
Thank you.
David, go ahead.
Yes, Marina, thank you very much. I'm just thinking of cultural change. I think it's a big thing in anthropology in general, but also in anthropology of Christianity, as far as I'm aware. So culture change, or the study of culture change or appropriation of Christian concepts is it's a very complex area of research, and you are demonstrating in this research you're doing that in fact this can be done. And so I'm really waiting to see when your monograph comes out. So I will have a complete or fuller picture of what you have to say, really. But what you're presenting really is substantively different from what other anthropologists of Christianity have said. So I have in mind a particular case of research done some time ago by Joel Robbins, who is well known to some of you. His research was on a group of people called the Rapmen. And his argument was that actually local traditions or local religions played absolutely no role in the Christianization of the Rapmen. So there was this absolute disjunction between the traditional religion and Christianity, and what Christianity did was to supplant the traditional religion in an absolute way. And he shows, evidence for it in the way he describes how culture change actually takes place among them. And your study seems to be quite distinctive in arguing that actually tradition does play a role, and it does play a continuing role in producing something that is more hybrid. So the past, in a sense, continues in the present. But my question is more centered on the present. And I'm just wondering to what extent the Presbyterian Church of Mizoram and modern Christians today see what you're trying to say. To what extent do they see the old continuing in the present, in their life and worship today, in the church today?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, David. Yes, I would say that. Can you unmute, David? Yeah. I would say that okay, there was a period in time when even the Mizo Christians were very vigilant in trying to sort of get rid of all the traditional Mizo elements. But then nowadays people are beginning to realize the richness and the value of their culture and where they have come from. So there's a lot of what would you say, a lot of efforts to also bring in and also produce hymns and songs which are sung in traditional style. Like they are Christian hymns, but then it has a different tone and tune that the Mizos use. So these are used in churches, so it's pretty much embraced. So and a Mizo would always say that unless there is a song which is called what do they call? Yeah, I forgot the word. A song that is sung in a Mizo tune, that they cannot really feel, they cannot really feel the spirit. They feel that singing, the hymns in the Western tune does not really get them connected with the Spirit, with the Holy Spirit. So they're still connected to the traditional way of singing. And also, yes, and also in the hymns, the terms like Pyalral is being used when you talk about heaven, and also about and also the way that the pre-Christian Mizos have imagined their passage to Pyalral is also connected in ways as to how they would start. They would go to paradise or to heaven after their death. They would have in hymns talking about when they would drink the nectar from the flower that I had mentioned, they would forget everything about their worldly life. That is also there. They would translate that as saying that we will forget all the worries of this world when we drink that, and we will be in heaven praising God and be in fellowship with him. So it's pretty much well embraced, I would say.
Okay. Stuart, did you have another question, or no? Mark Sproul. I'm sorry. Go first, Mark.
Marina, thank you for a fascinating presentation. And I enjoyed my visit to Mizoram, but I never got into that depth of understanding the situation I was in. So it's been very helpful. Thank you. My question really is about sort of bringing us into the present in some ways. I was fascinated at the beginning of your talk, you describing the Mizo connection with the land and with the animal kingdom, that very close connection. And I have very much in the front of my mind at the moment COP26 coming up and the environment conference and all thinking about that and our connection with the earth that we're becoming more conscious of once again today, our dependence upon the earth. And I'm looking at some of the more recent theological output from Tom Wright, where he emphasizes very much, challenges really Protestants on this understanding that in Revelation it's talking about the renewal of this earth. And when the new heaven and the new earth come down, it's actually a renewal of the good creation that God, that we read about in Genesis, where all creation is good in the eyes of God. And he also emphasizes that the resurrection body, the body of Jesus, is a physical resurrection body of this earth. And so I'm just wondering whether recovering the Mizo spirituality actually is a challenge to the Protestantism that got us thinking about God above clouds in the heaven and about the replacement of this earth with some superior spiritual earth, and of heaven as being in a completely different place and having nothing to do with this world, and whether we need again to be rethinking some of our theology about our connection with the earth and with the animal kingdom.
Yeah, I would. Thank you, Mark. I will start with, from what you said at the end, to talk about, the understanding and the interpretation of where heaven actually is after the Mizos embraced Christianity. So even though earlier, they were still mixing up as heaven as a special space in the temporal world, but slowly there is also it was not also very difficult for the Mizos to understand and accept and relate with God who resides above, because they already have a God, they already have the concept of Patyan, a high God who lives above in heaven, but they were never really bothered about Patyan. They just know that, they just believe that there is someone like that, because he never interfered with their life. He never created harm to them. So they were more busy with the evil spirit instead of with the high God who they assume was up in heaven. And we also have folklores and stories that talks about, maiden from the sky. We don't have the word heaven, so we call it the sky. So heaven from maidens from the sky who have wings and who sometimes come and visited the earthly place and interacted with that. So we do there was concept of a space above the sky. So it was not very difficult for that to relate. And yes, talking about land and the space and how they relate with that, I would say that it was totally different, because when they do their Jum cultivation, people believe that there's an understanding from the modern interpretation and consciousness that they are destroying the land by burn and slash. But then I would say that they don't actually do that, because they would do that for a year or two, and then they would move their village and go to a different place, and they would let the land rest. They would let the land rest and recover. So in that sense, they were more into preservation. And then so their way of life moving from land to land, so that they would allow the land where they had stayed earlier to rest and recover, was looked at and interpreted at differently by the British colonizers who came. They thought that these are empty lands, it doesn't belong to them. So they think that these are empty space which they could just come and occupy, whereas the concept of the ownership of the land was quite different in the Mizo's perspective. I don't know whether that answers your questions or give you some more ideas.
Thank you, Marina. Yes, thank you.
Tom, I would have a follow-up question if you look for someone, but you are muted.
Yes, go ahead. Sorry, Anton.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, I'm interested in that land issue, because I just read a research on Vanuatu in the South Pacific. And there seems to be some similarities, because the colonial powers there, it was the British and the French, also called that country a terra nullius, because they didn't accept the way the indigenous lived on the land, and they wanted to make use of the land themselves. But now that country is called Vanua, which means land in the Pacific language, Vanuatu, because they emphasize the theology of the land. That's very common in the South Pacific, to connect community, ancestors, land, and church. So is that also the case in Mizoram, that there is a specific theology of the land, kind of as a form of contextualized Christianity? Or is that different because people were more hunters rather than farmers?
They were not just hunters, they also had to farm. That was why we had this discussion about, the what do you call, the slash and burn way of agriculture and farming. I don't think they were really conscious about land and theology and all that stuff. They just did what they did. And they just use their common sense and understanding and knowledge of how they would be able to make use of the land. I don't think they really were too much into theologizing and trying to figure out a link and create a link between themselves and the land. I think these are all, of course, now they do. This is all, modern theologizing and reimagining the past and what the people would have done without. But I think the people at that time really did not think like that. But they did want to preserve the land because they need to go back, right, to recover so that they could cultivate there again. So in a way, I would say that sometimes we do romanticize about the past and give them too much credit about them theologizing and having all this, what do you call, theological insights and reflections and principles. Yeah.
Good. Go ahead, Stuart.
I wondered whether I might ask one of my other two questions, and that is, you used the word soul several times.
Yeah.
Now, soul, of course, is a much contested concept in philosophy, and so what I'm interested in is what is the Mizo concept that you're referring to when you say soul?
Yes. So we have a word which is called klarau. Okay, it's klarau is used for the soul. If I were to translate it literally, kla means shadow. So if it's klarau, it means the shadow of the person who has died. But sometimes it is also believed that a living person also has a shadow. There are stories where they have met that person, somewhere, and then they came home and suddenly they met somebody, had a conversation, talked with them, and was walking with them in the jungle or in the field, and left them there. But when they came back, they found that person at home. So there are several stories of that kind where they believe that even a living person has shadow, and that is called damlai tla, shadow while living, and klarau is your shadow after you die. So there's no really, we don't have a word for it. So we use klarau now for soul, but then even if we just use a word and translate and find a word to translate the English rendering of soul, the meaning is still different, where it comes from. So we use it for soul now.
That's very helpful. If you're going to wrap this up, I think it would be most helpful to actually add that in to your account.
Yeah.
Can I ask my third question, or is that greedy?
Oh, go ahead, Stuart, and then we'll go to Michael.
My third question is more of a sort of, having a thought which occurs to one as someone's giving a talk, which is, you made a distinction that I've heard many times in other contexts, saying people who became Christians did not have the concept of sin, but they did have the concept of being oppressed by evil spirits. And so they needed salvation for slightly different reasons. And that led me to think, well, you might think of sin and oppression by evil spirits as two non-overlapping concepts, but actually maybe they're not.
Yeah.
So if you're going to publish this, I think I would probably have a footnote or maybe something bigger, looking at the overlap between those concepts, because take, say, Saul's rage in the Old Testament when he throws a spear at David. That's presented as the influence of an evil spirit, but it's also losing it and doing something with potentially very ill consequences. So that there is an overlap there between the two concepts.
Yes, Stuart, that was very helpful. I think there are also several other examples where we do not have a Mizo word for certain things, because even for sin, we still do not have an exact word in the Mizo language. We use the word swal, which means naughty, which means bad, a bad person, a naughty person. So now we use that word swal to talk about sin. So it has a different meaning now, but you would be able to understand what that swal exactly mean, whether it's a sin, naughtiness, or being evil from the other words in the sentence. You would have to understand that. And there's also another word, I think Anton and Michael and even Tom, I think you would be aware of the conversation we had in Aizol, I think in November 2019, where there was a discussion about, the Mizos worshiping the evil spirit. Then I said, no, nobody worshiped, they did not worship them. Then I think Anton told me, but your Presbyterian Synod pastor told me that our ancestors worship the evil spirit here. Then that got me thinking, and I said, yes, wait a minute. The Mizos never had a word for worship. When they talk to the evils, when they were talking to the evil spirit, they would be just saying they are bia. Bia means talking, having a conversation. So the missionaries obviously came and asked them, what are they doing? And so I think the Mizos were said that they were talking to the spirits. And so now when they have God and they become Christians, they have to use the word bia to worship God, but it's not really depict that language. It's just that we're talking to God. So in that way, we are also now retracing and rewriting our histories from the perspective and usage and the word rendering of the words that we are using now, which comes from the Western European language meaning.
I like the word naughty for sin, and I believe I remember correctly that David Kossoff, who was an absolutely lovely Jewish actor, when he told Bible stories for children, he would describe David as a very naughty boy, and God was not pleased with him.
So, Mikhail, unmute and ask a question.
Yeah, Marina, thank you very much for this exciting and deep lecture. And I just wanted to ask a little bit more, what are these megaliths? I mean, can you say a little bit more about that? Because all of a sudden, I mean, you're speaking about the sources of the British people that you are quoting, like Lewin, which I find an exciting story, actually, really exciting. But then, and the oral sources, but there are megalithic structures which depict some of the history of the Mizo. Can I understand that like that way? And where do we find them?
Yes, I have to confess, I have not seen them myself, because most of this, archaeological evidences that I am quoting are in the border towards Myanmar side, and some of them are in Myanmar. So I was planning to travel there sometimes, but then because of the, because of the pandemic, I could not do, because the next step for me was to go there and, listen to the people's stories who live near the lake, who live near those places where we are supposed to have our history based. So I could not do that. And yes, the megalith, I was talking about a particular type of, a megalith, a stone monuments where the picture of a man would be curved, and also all the pictures of, wild animals that person would have killed. So, and then it tells a story about the greatness of that person, and also the animals, how much, it will be, you can count it. There were about maybe 7 mittens, 1 tiger or a cat, or even you would also have some heads there, some round figures, which means the numbers of enemies he had killed. So in that way, that stone would be at the entrance of a village, and the people of that village are also proud of that. They shared that we have such a person in our village. So you have those things, and then you also have one of the other thing that I had mentioned when I was responding to Stuart was about the Great Courtyard. It's full of megaliths, and it's a big courtyard, megalith stone with stories and all those things, and then leading into 7 directions. But then sadly, the Mizos, we did not really appreciate and value those, and many of those stones have been taken by the villagers nearby to build their walls and a fence and all that stuff. So most of it has been destroyed, which is a pity. It's only now that we are realizing about the importance and value of those things.
Good. Marina, oh no, David Singh, your hand just went up. David, go ahead.
Yes, I've been thinking about you, Marina, because I know you, and I know you for the last 5 years, and there are things you've revealed about your own family. I understand that you come from a culturally hybrid family, and I understand the Mizos in Mizoram, at least, are largely monocultural and monodenominational. But increasingly, there are mixed denominational and cultural affiliations. And I'm just wondering how this reality really impacts your ability to be able to see things differently. So what sort of conflicts or opportunities mixed cultural or denominational affiliations actually create for you when you're doing theology in particular?
Yeah, thank you, David, but unmute. Okay. Yeah, thank you, David. Yes, that's quite a difficult, I would say, a personal question, as you said that, and that I come from a mixed culture because my father is an Assamese. He comes from the high caste, the Brahmin caste. So during my childhood, when not in Mizoram, but when I was living in Meghalaya with my parents, we had a very different lifestyle, and we practice whole lot of things which I never understood. I understood them, about the customs of purity and pollution and all that. We practice whole lot of things in our household which I never understood. But it's only after I did my theological studies that I'm beginning to understand all those concepts. But then I would always call myself a Mizo because that's where I believe my identity is. It's also because of faith. My mother was a Presbyterian, my father was a Hindu, and he converted to Christianity and became a Presbyterian, a member of the Presbyterian Church. And that's where my identity is. And it's very community based. So after my father retired from his position, he says that, we are more Mizo, and that's where we are more, and it's more community oriented, and we would be more, adapt, or would you be able to, adapt to living in Mizoram rather than go living in the plains, because we so therefore, since I come from a mixed background, I believe that my Christian faith, which became a common identity for both my parents, my father who comes from a different background and my mother who comes from a different cultural background, Christianity became the uniting factor that brings about the common identity. And since that Christianity is the Mizo-Presbyterian Christianity, therefore, I associate myself with that. And yes, even a Mizo, even if you have a little bit of Mizo-ness in you, I would say blood, you cannot just become a Mizo by living in Mizoram. You have to have the blood of a Mizo. Okay, so even when we talk about, even you may have lots of diaspora Mizo migrants here and there, but we always say we want to go home. So home is always Mizoram. It's never elsewhere. So I have also shared this with some of my colleagues here when we talk about holidays. And I would say holidays for me is going home. It's not about traveling anywhere. Even I may be living in different part of the world, but I need to go home, for important events. So even the diaspora Mizo community, they may have a hybrid, experiences. and identity, but home will always call you back.
Yes.
I don't know whether that answers the question, David, but then that was a little bit personal. So yeah.
Yeah. What a fitting way to sum that up, Marina. This is completely up to you, and I didn't warn you of this, so please say no if this is any way inappropriate. But when I was in ISOL, I recorded in a Mizo church singing a Mizo song. Would you like me to play that really quick? If not, I won't suggest it. It's up to you.
Do it. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So then you can comment a little bit of what's going on. Let me just get it up here. Hope that everything will work. Okay, so. We'll play again here. There we go. Okay, let me stop share there. So there you go. Go
Yeah,
ahead,
so
Maria.
for those of you who have not seen the Presbyterian Church worship in Mizoram, you would not think that was a Presbyterian church. The Presbyterians, I will tell you now, are not always serious and do not smile in church. The reality is the Presbyterian Church in Mizoram are very charismatic, sometimes much more charismatic than the charismatic group that you would find in the global north. So that is because of the culture of the people. You see that people were dancing and they were singing hymns which are in the Mizo traditional tune, and that is what they call real singing and being with the spirit, relating to the spirit. And what was happening there is that so they have the songs and they are dancing and singing around because they're filled with the spirit. So they are praising God. And this is very cultural because the Mizo way of life was filled with hard work. And at the end of the day, when they have their free time, they would drink together and they would dance together and sing hymns. So this has been brought into the church, and that bring about a spirit of unity, a spirit of being a part of the community and being together.
Yeah, thank you, Marina. I just wish I could bring some of that back to my Presbyterians in North America. It's really quite a wonderful worship service to be involved with, and the excitement and the spirit is absolutely wonderful. With that, I'll turn over to Alfred. Unmute and ask the question.
Thank you, my house tutor, for a fascinating lecture. And also, I wasn't going to ask a question, but that last clip forced me to it, because we have in Chile our Mapuche people. And to see the Mitzvah dancing, it was so like the Pentecostalized Anglicans. And as you know, some of my research is in that area. My question is this: following, say, Anderson's research, you see the spreading flame of fire of Pentecostalism right through the world. Here we had Anglican Mapuches who were staid and well-behaved for a long time. And then there came this revival, this Pentecostalizing, in the sense that there was a Book of Acts type of Christianity that suddenly flared up. Did you see this sort of thing occurring? And is that the answer for Tom's Presbyterians as well? Is that what occurred? Were there waves of Pentecostalization that led to this revival, as there were here among the Mapuche people? And I can tell you of a witch doctor who was a good Anglican, and then she was suddenly Pentecostalized and became a flaming evangelist in the whole area. That sort of phenomenon.
Yeah, thank you, Alfred. That's a very important point, because I would always argue that Pentecostalism did not start in Asuja Street, because this is all traditional. It's all happened in the local level. the Spirit moves in different ways at different space, and it doesn't have to be connected with the Pentecostal movement that started in Azusa Street. So I would say that, yeah, we do all that, speaking in tongues, and yeah, exorcism, I would say, though we don't use that word exorcism, but then, because they also are aware, we're also aware that everything is not good. All the spirits are not good. There are also bad spirits. So there is practice of, deliverance from the spirit. But then one good thing that I would say is that there is an awareness of a great difference between prosperity gospel and, charismatic and Pentecostal sort of religiosity, I would say, because we do not do the prosperity thing that if you do something good, you would be what would you say, you would be rewarded and everything, you'll gain more. That is, I can say, thankfully we are not there. So yeah, it would be similar to Pentecostalism.
Thank you so much.
Good. Well, with that, I think we'll bring it to a close. Marina, thank you for such a great lecture and such insight into the phenomenal church of Mizoram and what's gone on there, and also how that resonates with the deep culture. I would just add a further comment that the whole idea of powers and principalities in Christus Victor is deep, and probably what they experience is close to what many saw in Christ in the very, very early church. You see this in the book of Colossians and elsewhere, where there's this sense of overcoming various things that they felt were threatening them or haunting them in the spiritual world that they say is Christ was victorious over. So again, just a great lecture and good insight. Again, this is recorded, and so this will be up on YouTube if you want to visit any of the things that have appeared. Next week, we're going to do a bit of a shift, and we're moving to a very interesting area of mission research. We're going to have a series of lectures on the use of big data and quantitative analysis and mission. And we have a great lineup coming up. We have Gina Zerlo, who works with Todd Johnson with the Center for Study of World Christianity in Boston next week. We've got a woman, Rachel McCleary from Harvard University, who has been doing research in Guatemala and Central America and using big data to look at those areas. And we have several other speakers working right now with a speaker from Japan and looking at how good analysis has been providing real insight into Japan and missions in Japan. So I think this will be an excellent series coming forward. A note to remember on that, next week we will move to GMT from BST. So Greenwich Mean Time will be our mean time for starting next week. This week we're on British Summer Time. So there's going to be a shift back of the clock's 1 hour and a shift back of the lecture in terms of general time from British Summer Time to Greenwich Mean Time. But that's on the announcement that went out by email, so you should get that, and that should work well. So again, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you next week. And again, thank you so much, Marina.